My first guest is author and political activist, though, Richard Seymour. His thought-provoking new book is called The Liberal Defence of Murder, which takes apart brilliantly the so-called humanitarian justifications for war and slaughter by liberal and left appeasers. It was the Iraq War, Richard, which sparked your book, I've no doubt, but it could apply to so many other conflicts in the last decade, yeah?
Absolutely. It was the Iraq War that spawned the book, but when I went back to look at this tradition, it goes back for approximately 400 years. I mean...
That long, my goodness. I was thinking of a decade. Tell us.
Well, I mean, it's easy to see these people as, to some extent, people who've moved to the right after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And to some extent after the 9/11 attacks. But if you look back at their justifications for war and for empire as a humanitarian venture, as something that delivers liberalism and progress, you can find these arguments come from people like John Stuart Mill, who argued that the peoples of, the colonized peoples were not fit yet for self-government and had to be schooled for that situation by enlightened European states. But you can even go back further than that. You can go back to John Locke and Hugo Grotius, for example. And really it's striking the extent of the barbarity that has been justified on humanitarian grounds or on the grounds of progress. I mean, you can talk about the colonization of India being justified in these terms, but you could even talk about the justifications for antebellum slavery in the United States, whose defenders often cited its benefits for civilization and for the people who were enslaved themselves.
They used to dress it up in religious clothes, though, didn't they, with the Bible in one hand and the rifle in the other. This latest period has been characterized by a liberal humanitarian interventionism, which is at least a step change, isn't it?
It is, yeah. I mean, I actually think that a lot of the support for empire, certainly in the late 19th and early 20th century, came from people who were secular, particularly in France. They despised the clerics, but they knew that they were useful for selling the French message. So Paul Bert, for example, who was a Republican and very secular, appeared before the masses in Amman and Tonkin and told them, I think it was Annam and Tonkin, sorry, and told them that France was here on a civilizing mission. It would raise up their living standards and so on and so forth. And what subsequently happened was a social catastrophe. But the clerics were there to help win people over to accepting those conditions. So it was quite useful. And I think the Bush administration, although it framed its policies in secular terms, also appeased and appealed to the religious fundamentalists on their side.
Well, the famous crusade, so-called gaffe by Bush, but it must have been a carefully chosen word.
I think so, yes.
We've had these parade of apostates, haven't we, led by, I suppose, the Englishman abroad, Christopher Hitchens, people who wore their former leftism and used it as a cover for these wars. Is this a new phenomenon? I mean, these were not just liberals. These were former revolutionaries.
Quite. I mean, Christopher Hitchens is a bit unique in this respect. I mean, he takes a very scholastic version of Marxism and says that basically since the Soviet Union has collapsed, the United States is now the major force of historical progress, and so we've got to rely on them to defeat the forces of reaction, and that includes everybody who's opposed to the United States of America, who are preemptively pathologized as, evildoers and barbarians, in language that's strikingly redolent of 19th century Victorian imperialism. Indeed. But it's not new.
We have others, though, don't we, in Britain, less well known than Hitchens, but Aronovich, the former communist, now a columnist on the Times, thundering about against Islam and Muslims and decked up in the clothes of the progressive, but actually serving the deepest reaction.
Sure. And as you say, it's not new. This goes back to the neoconservatives, who some of them were Trotskyists, some of them were Social Democrats, and they were won over gradually to quite militant American expansionism and aggression. In the case of David Aronovich and people of that ilk, they're championing something that they call Western values. Now, I don't know of any value that I would defend that is specifically Western. Human rights, feminism, so on, I would think that are values that could be universal. But what they're doing, for example, in the case of defending feminism in Afghanistan, talking about liberating women, is they're appealing to an agency that is responsible for far worse barbarities than the ones that they address. This was quite familiar and quite common during the 19th century when feminists, proto-feminists, for example, looked to the Indian situation and looked to the British Empire to emancipate women without paying attention to the fact that they were massacring people en masse. They looked to it as a sort of humanitarian agency, a human rights service, and it was nothing of the sort. And I think it's the same problem that we're getting here today.
How useful have these idiots been to the war effort?
I think it's a very good question. People often wonder, I mean, because they look like a marginal and discredited bunch. But if you take the arguments of the White House and the Pentagon and you compare them to what they've been saying, they're fairly close. The only thing is that they give them a sort of left or liberal gloss. The trouble is that a lot of people look at White House press briefings and the Pentagon announcements and just regard them cynically. You get someone like Christopher Hitchens, who had a mountainous reputation as a great writer, and indeed he was. And he uses his immense talents and his reputation on the left to sell exactly the same message. So to some extent they're screening them from criticism.
I described him as the only known example of a butterfly metamorphosing back into a slug.
Yes.
And he did once write like an angel, but now serves the devil. They've burned all their progressive, or most of them, credentials.
Yeah.
Will the ruling elite, will the reactionaries have any further use for them? I mean, where does Hitchens fit in the new Obama era, for example?
I think it would be even more important, not Hitchens as much. I think he's really discredited himself to some extent. People ask me, is Christopher Hitchens ever going to come back to the left? And I'd say, do you want him back after all this?
Who would want him,
as
yes.
a point of honour. But I think that general school of thought is going to be more important, because Bush could ultimately rely on people who really didn't care that much about human rights, religious fundamentalists and so on. Obama has to appeal to a constituency, a progressive constituency of Democratic voters who don't support the war in Afghanistan, who don't support the idea of having aggression against Iran and so on. And to that extent, if he's going to escalate in Afghanistan, perhaps up to 30,000 more troops, he has to find a way to relate to them. Now, his cohorts in the new administration are people like Hillary Clinton, Susan Rice, who wants to bomb Sudan. I mean, it's a real list of liberal hawks. One of them is Joseph Biden, the vice president, who advocated the tripartite partition of Iraq on the basis of the Yugoslav model, which has been such a fantastic success. And I mean, the attitudes of these people are so arrogant. I'm not talking about Obama himself. I have some mild hopes for the guy, but the administration and the people he's got in it are extremely arrogant. Joseph Biden said, when it seemed that the Iraqi administration didn't want to go his way and didn't want to go along with what America wanted, he said, I don't know who the hell they think they are. We've expended blood and treasure on this. So the very fact of conquest is a justification for their right to do whatever they want with Iraq. And I think it's extremely worrying what's happening, but I think it's also very important for them to find a way to relate those policies to their liberal supporters.
Well, the very best of luck with the book. It's a cracking read, published by Verso. Is it doing well?
It's doing well on the Amazon charts at the moment. I haven't got any total sales figures, but it seems to be doing well.
The very best of luck with it. Buy the book, viewers. It's incisive, learned, and unanswerable. Published, as I say, by Verso. Go on to Amazon and click on it now.